So on June 25th, 1950, North Korea will invade. Now, this image shows destroyed North Korean tanks. This is from Life magazine. But one thing I want to stress is that those tanks did some serious work in this invasion. The South Koreans lacked the necessary equipment to stop these tanks. And later, when Americans will intervene, we also lack the necessary equipment. For example, American soldiers would shoot bazooka rounds into these tanks and it wouldn't stop them. These tanks are tanks that later on the Americans were able to destroy, or the South Korean forces were able to destroy. But early on, in the initial invasion, North Korean forces just put their tanks up front and just roll over a lot of South Korean resistance. The South Koreans will fight hard, but they just don't have the technology and equipment that North Korea has. And so they are very quickly pushed back, right? One thing I want to point out that's fascinating is that North Korea, actually, the government told its soldiers that they were being attacked by the South Koreans and they were responding. So I find it fascinating that they, even to this day, North Koreans honestly believe that they were defending, that they weren't attacking. They thought that they were attacked and then launched a counterattack that proved to be so successful that they almost conquered the South and reunified Korea. In fact, of course, this isn't what happened. North Korea invaded first. But it's interesting that even to this day, like I said, this is not the story that the North Korean people are told. They're told that they were invaded first, and as the North, that they were then forced to fight back, and they launched this kind of counterattack that proved to be very successful, at least for a time. This will become more important as we continue on to talk about North Korea. Now, it turns out that Kim Il-sung will be really, really wrong. He thought that he would be able to defeat and conquer South Korea very quickly before the United States and the United Nations could do anything. But he's wrong. The South Korean forces will fight back and delay North Korean forces. And this will give, and also American soldiers will also be sent right away and help defend against these North Koreans. And this will give the United States time to bring this issue to the newly created United Nations. And this will lead to the United Nations branding North Korea as an aggressor because it attacked South Korea. The Republic of Korea, remember, the Republic of Korea is recognized by the United Nations as the only legitimate government in Korea. North Korea, no, it is not a legitimate government. So this allows North Korea to be branded kind of a rogue aggressor and justifies then the defense of the Republic of Korea by the United Nations. And 16 United Nations countries will actually send troops. The most of the troops are sent by the United States, but Britain sends a contingent. And it's interesting, if you look at this, a lot of different countries send contingents. Thailand sends troops. India sends troops. Ethiopia sends troops. On the right are a picture of a Filipino contingent that was sent to fight. The Soviet Union actually, though, was boycotting things. It could have stopped this dispatch of troops by using its veto as part of the Security Council. Right? If you remember the Security Council, you can veto any kind of major action. But the Soviet Union was actually boycotting during this time period, so they were not actually able to prevent the United Nations from intervening. So this will then give more kind of legality to American forces intervening. Right? So I want to stress, there's other United Nations countries that take part, but the bulk of the United Nations forces are Americans. And also there's a large number, of course, of South Korean troops who are going to fight back. But now, because Kim Il-sung is not able to unify the country quickly enough, the U.S. has time to bring over troops from Japan, right? Remember, we were occupying Japan in this time period. We've got the soldiers right there. We can bring them over. Even so, it still is a hard-fought war. If you look on the right, those are pictures of American soldiers who have been taken from Japan and sent to Korea, to the port of Pusan. If you look to the picture on the left, you can see how quickly the North Korean forces are pushing down into southern Korea. But you can see that there's kind of a circle, and it's labeled the Pusan Perimeter in the southeast of Korea. That's a perimeter of where forces that were holding off against the North Koreans. So that's like American, UN, and South Korean troops who are going to be holding that. And they are able to hold that perimeter to prevent the North from going any further, right? So they're going to stop the northern advance before it completely takes over South Korea and unifies the country. General Douglas MacArthur will then land American forces at Incheon. Incheon is an area just south of Seoul. He's going to launch an amphibious landing, which will basically then surround North Korean forces. Right. This is a very brilliant amphibious assault. It works beautifully, and it helps lead to because it cuts, in a sense, the North Korean army into two. It forces North Koreans to fall back very quickly. And this is a key turning point in the war. And as an aside, if you go to Korea, when you land, you're probably going to land at Incheon Airport, right? It's very close to Seoul. It's very close to the capital. Once Incheon is taken, then American, Korean, and UN forces are going to quickly take back the city of Seoul, the capital. The river that separates northern Korea from China is called the Yalu River. And what's going to happen is, now that North Korean forces are on the run or falling back, then UN, U.S., and South Korean forces are going to chase after them, because now it's not simply about repelling an invasion. Now the idea is, we can actually unify Korea now under the Republic of Korea, under the UN-sponsored government, right? So now, again, there's this hope. Both Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee dreamed of uniting Korea, right? Of course, under their own respective government. Well, now it looks like the South Koreans, Republic of Korea, is going to succeed in doing this. However, remember, I just said how the Yalu is the border between Northern Korea and China. The last thing that China wanted was an anti-communist unified Korea on its doorstep. Did not want that, right? So the Chinese will decide to intervene to help out the North Koreans. Now, one thing I think it's fascinating about China, and we'll talk more about this later, is how how they name things is very interesting, because, we have bland names, I guess. Americans talk about the Great War, World War I, or World War II, or the American Civil War, and things like that. The war, the way that the Chinese referred to this war in Korea was the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea, right? That was how they referred to this war. Now, it's striking in a sense that China intervened in this war. Remember, China is exhausted from fighting against Japan. It just fought, after that, a civil war. The communists won that war in 1949. This is late 1950. So there was really an argument in China and the Chinese government, should we intervene or not? Right? Because if we intervene and this does not go well, we could be overthrown. Right? Our government is not secure. If we fight, the Americans may just say, hey, this is a great time to kick the communists out. The nationalists could then come back. So it's a very difficult choice. But Mao Zedong, who holds a minority view, he actually wants to intervene. A lot of Chinese leaders say we can't do this. But Mao will insist that this needs to be done. And he does this for a variety of reasons. One is he's concerned about security. Right? Remember, historically, China wants an independent, friendly Korea. Right? It doesn't want to control Korea, but it wants a friendly government. There was an exception we talked about in the later 19th century when China was basically trying to colonize Korea. Japan kicked the Chinese out. But for the most part, China does not want to actually control Korea. It just wants a friendly Korea. So there's concerns about security, right? It does not want to control Korea, but also does not want a unified anti-communist Korea as its neighbor. That's very dangerous to its security. Mao Zedong also viewed the United States as the most dangerous imperialist, and he just didn't think he could allow the U.S. to continue to expand its influence. He said, we got to stop them now. Better we stop them in Korea than in China. Right? So it's kind of that same thinking that caused China to intervene on Korea's behalf way back in the 16th century when Japan invaded. And of course, from the communist perspective, they're supposed to be encouraging worldwide communist revolution. Right? If North Korea was defeated, that would be a huge setback for communism, right? We had a communist government that existed. It was defeated, and the communist countries did not lift a finger to help. This would be a huge setback. It's similar to the UN's perspective, right? The UN says we have to defend South Korea because if we don't, no one will take the UN seriously. Well, it's similar to this too, right? If we communists do not help defend a communist country, that would be a setback for us, and no one will take us communists seriously. And I don't know how much Mao felt this, but definitely among some Chinese, they felt a debt to North Korea because North Korean soldiers had helped China win its civil war, So it made sense to repay that debt by sending their own troops to help. And I think that's significant. So Mao will end up taking the gamble and intervening. And I want to stress, he turns out to be right. And this is one thing we have to understand about Mao Zedong, especially later on. He often takes a minority opinion, and he's often right. So he'll have people say, oh, peasants aren't important, workers are important. He's like, no, the peasants are important. That's how we're going to win the revolution. And he wins. He tells people, hey, we got to intervene to help North Korea against the United States, against the UN. And people will say, no, that's wrong. That's too risky. But it turns out he's right, because the Chinese will push back the Americans and the UN and the South Korean forces. And we just have to keep that in mind, as Mao is often right when the majority of people are wrong. That's for later. For now, I just want us to stress that China will intervene, and it will intervene effectively and successfully push back UN, American, and U.S. forces. And Korean forces, South Korean forces. What helps save the United Nations South Korean American war effort is the United Nations firepower. We are able to control the skies, and that plays an important role in pushing back the Chinese and the North Korean forces, and in preserving the American, UN, and South Korean forces from destruction. Right, so we basically are going to control the skies for the most part, and that's going to help serve the war effort. In addition, because the UN American forces control the skies, that means we're going to drop a huge amount of bombs on North Korea. And it's kind of sad in a sense when you think about it. I mean, bombing is sad because it kills lots of civilians, don't get me wrong. But what makes this particularly sad was a lot of the industry that the Japanese had helped build up in North Korea was still there and was still operating. And then we just blew it all up. And we actually dropped more bombs in terms of tonnage, in terms of explosive tonnage on North Korea than we did on Japan during World War II. So we actually bombed North Korea more than we did Japan. So it's really striking. But because we control the skies, that's what's going to happen. And believe me, there are museums and there are craters left from the bombing that the North Koreans still point to and say, look what the Americans did to us. And this is an important kind of physical reminder to them of the dangerous world that they feel that they live in. We'll talk more about that later on. But that's key to understanding the North Korean perspective, is this feeling that we are beset by a hostile world. I mean, look at what the Americans did with the bombings. And the thing is, the best propaganda is often true, right? Because we did bomb North Korea, killed a large number of civilians, destroyed a lot of buildings and factories and so forth. What ends up happening is by 1951, the forces are largely balanced against each other, so no one can win a decisive victory. They settle into a kind of stalemate that essentially looks like World War I, because there's a lot of trench warfare, basically. They build these fortifications. They're very difficult to take, but relatively easy to hold. And there's a desire by the China and by the United States, especially, to try and end these things. So they will, in 1951, engage in armistice talks. These proceed very slowly, but eventually an armistice is signed in 1953. Now, the Koreans on both sides did not like this. Kim Il-sung did not like this. Syngman Rhee did not like this, right? The Koreans wanted this fought to a finish. However, the great powers did not want escalation. There was a fear that if they were to escalate, to actually try and break the stalemate, that would eventually lead to World War III, right? Because if the United States escalated, for example, and we had the ability to escalate had we chose to, then probably the Soviet Union would get involved, and then we would have World War III. So the great powers, China, the United States, and even though the Soviet Union's technically not a part of this, they're behind the scenes advising the China and the North Korea. And basically, none of these big countries want escalation. We can live with the vision, right? We can live with the vision. The poor Koreans, though, they can't, right? Or rather, I should say, they don't want to be divided, but there's just nothing they can do about it. And this is kind of the tragedy, in a sense, of the Korean nation faces, is that so often their destiny is decided by other larger, more powerful countries. And one thing I hope you get out of this class is to appreciate that kind of frustration and to kind of consider it whenever you are taking action, right? That And it can be a small country. It could be someone who isn't particularly powerful in society. But we can see that frustration that they're oftentimes basically become almost pawns of the great powers. Syngman Rhee does not like this, and he actually refuses to sign the document. Right? Syngman Rhee never agrees to the armistice. Kim Il-sung is under much more control by the Soviet Union and much more influenced by China, so he will sign in the end. But one thing I want to point out, this is an armistice, not a peace treaty. The war is technically ongoing, and North Korea had actually some years ago said that it was renouncing the armistice, so supposedly we're just at a state of war right now, which is kind of disturbing to think about. So if we think about casualties, China, we're not sure how many people the Chinese lost. They're rather secretive about this and about their military strength, so we're not sure, but estimates are between 150 to 400,000 dead. That's a lot of people. UN forces probably lost around 40,000. That's a lot of people. But what's really striking is the amount of Koreans that were killed. In Korea, about 2.5 million civilians and 2.5 million soldiers were killed. About 5 million Koreans will die. However, Korea only had a population at this time of about 30 million people. So my math's not the greatest, but I think that means that 1 out of every 6 Koreans died. That's like 18% or so, 17, 18% of Koreans will die in this war. That is horrific, right? When you think about it, right? That amount of death for such a small country with such a small population to absorb is just horrible. But here's the thing, nothing changes, right? At least if Korea would have finally been unified, they could have said, well, at least our country is free and independent now, and it was unfortunate, this was very sad, this sacrifice, but at least something good came out of it. But nothing really good comes out of this, right? Nothing really changes, nothing good comes out of this. A whole bunch of people are dead for what? This is a war in which neither of the Korean sides can claim victory. North Korea, South Korea, they can't really call this a victory, right? So it's just a very sad thing from the Korean perspective and just from a human perspective, and that all these people die, and we can't really say the world is better for it. So what then is the significance of this war from an East Asian perspective? Korean War, what we call it in the United States, is, if someone were to say to me, Dr. Rausch, who won the Korean War? I would say Japan and China won the Korean War. Why? Well, a key moment, as will be discussed later in this class, in Japan's recovery after World War II is the money it made helping to supply American troops in the Korean War. Right? Japan is right next to Korea. It still has something of an industrial base. It's been developing that industrial base since Japan was defeated in World War II. It is in a perfect position to supply American forces because it's right there. And that infusion of cash, that infusion of money to buy all that stuff that the Americans need to fight, that's going to help put Japan on the road to economic recovery. Yoshida Shigeru, the prime minister of Japan at the time, said that the Korean War was like a gift from the gods. And that's really a sad way to kind of think about it. Considering what it did to the Korean people. But from the Japanese perspective, they win this war, right? Japan comes out of this war much wealthier than it had been, and this kind of jumpstarts its economy. It had a lot of economic problems before this, and this really helps put it on the road to economic recovery. Why would I say China is a winner in this war? Well, after this war, people have to take China seriously. I have to stress this because I think this is one thing, and I certainly mean no disrespect to our veterans, but one thing that has happened in the United States is we're in kind of a state of denial about the Korean War. The Chinese pushed our troops back. We had troops in North Korea getting ready to unify the country, and the Chinese pushed us back. Now, the American troops fought well and fought hard, but ultimately, we wanted to be somewhere. The Chinese wanted us there, and the Chinese pushed us out. So China proved that it was no longer a country that could be walked over. Right? Remember, early part of this class was talking about how China's getting beaten up by everybody. But here, the Chinese, in alliance with North Korea, stood up to the United States and the United Nations and pushed them back. It's true they couldn't defeat them, but they pushed them back. And that's enough, right? That's enough that China has to be taken seriously, right? China's not going to be walked over by anyone anymore. And sometimes people look back at the Vietnam War and say, why did the Americans fight harder? Why didn't we commit more troops? Why didn't we invade North Vietnam? The answer is simple. When we invaded North Korea, China intervened. If we invaded North Vietnam, China probably would have intervened again. So China now has to be taken seriously. That's why if someone were to say to me, who won the Korean War, I would say Japan and China. Now, what's also of significance about the war for our purposes is we now have a massive transformation in what constitutes East Asia, right? When we began this course, what constituted East Asia was China, Japan, and Korea. After 1910, it was China and the Japanese Empire because Korea had been absorbed in the Japanese Empire. So it went from 3 to 2. Now, we have 5 East Asian players when we factor in the Chinese Civil War, because now we have the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that's North Korea. We have the People's Republic of China, that's Communist China. We have the Republic of China, which is nationalist China, the China of Taiwan. We have the Republic of Korea, which is South Korea. And then we just have Japan. Japan's easy because it didn't get divided. Right? So we started off this course with 3 countries in East Asia, dropped down to 2. Now we're down to, in a sense, 3 nations, Japan, China, and Korea, represented by 5 governments. And that's one thing that makes East Asia such a complex and fascinating place to study, but also a place we need to understand because of its global importance and how, as you can see, notice as I've told this story, how America is involved in this. So it's very important for Americans in particular, I think, to understand what's going on in East Asia.